What if I told you that for over 600 years, across some of the most powerful nations in Europe, there existed a system designed to make babies disappear? Not metaphorically, not quietly behind closed doors, but through a literal mechanism built into the walls of churches and hospitals. A system so normalized, so widely accepted that millions of children passed through it, and most of them never came out alive. And the strangest part? The evidence is still all around us today, hidden in plain sight, in last names, in archives, in buildings people walk past every day without ever realizing what happened inside. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a single tragedy. It was an entire system. And almost nobody talks about it. To understand how something like this could exist, you have to go back to a time when being born into the wrong circumstances wasn't just difficult, it was a death sentence. In medieval and early modern Europe, society was built on rigid rules. Your status, your legitimacy, your worth, these were determined the moment you were born. And if a child was born outside of marriage, that child carried a stigma so heavy it could ruin not just their life, but their mother's as well. For many women, especially those living in poverty, there were no good options, no social safety nets, no support systems, only shame, punishment, and survival. And that's where the system began. In the late 12th century, a decision was made that would quietly reshape cities across Europe. After reports of infants being abandoned and even found in rivers, a solution was introduced, not to solve the root problem, but to manage its consequences. They built wheels into walls. These devices were simple, a rotating wooden cylinder set into the exterior wall of a building, just large enough to hold a newborn baby. A mother could approach unseen, place her child inside, turn the wheel, and walk away. On the other side, a bell would ring. Someone inside would retrieve the baby. No questions asked, no names recorded, no identities revealed. It was called, in some places, the Wheel of the Exposed. At first glance, it sounds almost compassionate, a way to save children who might otherwise be abandoned in the streets, a way to give desperate mothers an option. And that's exactly how it was presented. But what happened after the wheel turned is where the story changes. Because once inside those buildings, these children didn't enter a system of care. They entered a system of survival, and survival was rare. In city after city, country after country, the pattern repeated itself. The number of babies being left at these wheels grew rapidly. What started as a few hundred per year in some places quickly became thousands. Entire institutions were built around receiving these children. But there was a problem. No one had prepared for this scale. Hospitals became overcrowded, resources stretched thin, disease spread quickly in confined spaces filled with vulnerable infants, and the people responsible for their care were often overwhelmed, underpaid, or simply unequipped to handle the numbers. But even that doesn't fully explain what happened, because the system didn't just struggle under pressure, it adapted in ways that made things worse. In some cases, mothers who abandoned their own children at the wheel would immediately apply for work inside the same institution, as wet nurses. They would be paid to feed and care for other infants, but not their own. Their child would remain anonymous, lost within the system, and they would earn a wage by nurturing someone else's baby. Think about that for a second. A system where a mother is separated from her child, then paid to replace that bond with another. It wasn't just inefficient. It was deeply, structurally broken. And the numbers began to reflect that. In many of these institutions, mortality rates climbed higher and higher over time. What may have started as already dangerous conditions became something far worse. In some places, more than half of the children didn't survive. In others, it reached levels that are almost impossible to comprehend. 80%, 90%. In certain years, nearly every child who entered died. And this wasn't hidden information. Records existed. Reports were written. Investigations were conducted. But the system continued. Because by then, it had become something larger than its original purpose. It wasn't just about saving children anymore. It was about managing a social problem in a way that allowed society to look away. The wheel made abandonment invisible. It removed the public display of desperation and replaced it with a quiet mechanism, a turn of wood, a ringing bell, a child gone from sight. And that invisibility mattered. Because when suffering is out of view, it becomes easier to ignore. But there were moments when the reality became too obvious to hide. In some institutions, conditions deteriorated to the point where even officials couldn't deny what was happening. Reports described overcrowded rooms, lack of basic care, and the rapid spread of illness among infants who had no ability to fight it. Children arrived already weak, some having traveled long distances under harsh conditions just to reach these places. Others didn't survive the journey at all. An entire network developed around transporting infants from rural areas to urban institutions. People were paid to carry multiple babies at once, sometimes over hundreds of miles. The goal was simple: deliver the child. What happened after that was no longer their concern. And along the way, many of those children never even made it to the door. But perhaps the most unsettling part of this entire system isn't just the scale or the mortality rates, or even the conditions inside these institutions. It's the evidence left behind by the mothers. Because many of them didn't simply leave their child and walk away. They left something else. A small object. A token. Sometimes it was a piece of fabric. Sometimes a coin split in half. Sometimes a small piece of jewelry or a bead tied with string. These items had a purpose. They were meant as identifiers, a way for a mother to one day return and prove that a specific child was hers. A fragile hope that the separation wasn't permanent, that one day, somehow, she could come back. But here's the part that changes everything. Those tokens were never returned. They were kept, stored, cataloged, preserved as objects while the relationships they represented were erased. Think about what that means. The system didn't just separate families, it archived the evidence of that separation. It turned deeply personal acts of love and desperation into records, into artifacts, into something to be filed away. And for the children, those objects, the only link to their origins, remained forever out of reach. Over time, something else began to happen. The system started leaving marks that would outlast the institutions themselves. Names, because every child who entered through those wheels needed an identity. And since their real identities were unknown, new ones were created. Surnames that weren't passed down from families, but assigned by institutions. Names that often carried hidden meanings. Some meant found, others meant abandoned. Some were tied directly to the place that received them. And these names didn't disappear when the system ended. They stayed, passed down through generations, becoming some of the most common surnames in entire regions. Which means that today, there are millions of people carrying names that trace back to this system without even realizing it. A last name that looks ordinary on the surface might actually be a marker, a historical echo of a moment when an ancestor was placed into a wall and given a new identity. A point in a family tree where everything before it simply stops. No records, no lineage, just a name assigned by a stranger. And that might be the most lasting impact of all. Because while the buildings were repurposed and the wheels were sealed and the institutions eventually shut down, the names remained. Living evidence. Now here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because for a long time, it was assumed that these systems, as flawed as they were, still served a necessary purpose. that they reduced worse outcomes, that they were, in some way, better than the alternatives. But when researchers began analyzing what happened after these systems were shut down, the results told a different story. In places where the wheels were removed and the system ended, something surprising happened. Abandonment rates dropped. Infant mortality decreased. In other words, removing the system saved lives. Which raises a question that's difficult to ignore. If ending the system improved outcomes, what does that say about the system itself? Was it ever truly about saving children? Or was it about making a problem easier to manage, even if the cost was hidden? Because once you start looking at it that way, the entire structure begins to feel different. Less like a solution, more like a mechanism. One that processed human lives quietly, efficiently, and with just enough distance to avoid scrutiny. And perhaps that's why it lasted so long, because it didn't demand attention. It didn't force society to confront the root causes of abandonment, poverty, stigma, inequality. Instead, it created a way to move those consequences out of sight, out of mind, and into institutions where the outcomes could be recorded, but not necessarily acknowledged. Even when evidence of failure became undeniable, the system didn't immediately collapse. It continued, adjusted, reframed, justified, because dismantling it would have required something much more difficult than maintaining it. It would have required change, real structural change, and that's often the hardest thing for any society to face. So instead, the system remained. For centuries, processing millions of children, leaving behind records, names, and artifacts that still exist today. And yet, despite all of that, this story is rarely discussed. It's not something most people learn in school, it's not widely covered in popular history. It exists in archives, in academic papers, in museums, but not in everyday conversation. Which makes you wonder, why? Why does something of this scale, this impact, this human cost remain so obscure? Maybe it's because it challenges a narrative we're more comfortable with. The idea that institutions, especially those built under the banner of care or charity, are fundamentally benevolent. But history isn't always that simple. Sometimes systems created with good intentions evolve into something else entirely. Something that persists not because it works, but because it's easier than the alternative. And sometimes, the evidence doesn't disappear, it just changes form. A last name, a forgotten record, a sealed opening in the side of a building, a small object in a drawer that was never meant to be kept. All of it still there, waiting for someone to ask the right question. So here's the question you're left with. If something like this could exist for 600 years in plain sight across entire nations, what else might we be overlooking today? And how would we even know? If you found this story as unsettling as it is fascinating, there's more hidden history like this that rarely gets talked about. Subscribe and stay curious.